Thank you for having me. I'm not a professional speaker. I'm just a guy growing citrus trees in Florida, so I'm one of y'all. And I'm not a researcher or anything like that, so I'm not going to scare you. So I'm going to share with you some facts and some experiences we had that maybe can help you guys out, and so maybe you won't make the same mistakes we made. So this is our newest citrus nursery. We built it back in, actually we started on the metal building we call the head house here in November of '06. And then we built these structures we call a range. And a range consists of 16 hoop houses. And we started phase 1 and 2 in January of '07, planted the liners here in the spring of '07, and actually shipped trees out in '08. And while we were growing trees here, we were building this one. So we kind of did it in a couple of different phases. We'll give you a little bit of a historical perspective, and I'll be real quick because most of you already know the story. It started out kind of sad, but it actually got better. And we got a couple of diseases that y'all don't have. And citrus canker we thought was the end of the world, but we learned how to live with it. And then we got greening disease. And more than likely, those diseases were brought in illegally by homeowners. And the biggest issue was protecting our budwood source. There's a couple of dates. Citrus canker was in Dade County. That's where everything comes in Florida. Big port there, almost like a whole different country. And in '95 is where we had the canker detected. And that's when they implemented a 1,900-foot rule where they burned a 1,900-foot radius around the find. And that was going good till we started getting these lawsuits here from homeowners. They had no regard for our industry, just for that 1 or 2 trees in their backyard. So everything got delayed by lawsuits, and the result was we had some hurricanes in '04 and '05. We had 3 hurricanes come right through the state, and it pretty much dispersed the citrus canker throughout the whole industry. So at that point, it was a lost cause. As a result of that, it also moved canker into the nurseries because a lot of our citrus nurseries were grown outside, field trees we call it, grown in the ground, a bare root tree. And we had 62% of our nursery stock that was destroyed. I know 62% sounds like a lot, but just to give you another perspective, there's about 5.5 million trees we lost in 1 year. And there's the number again. Probably what hurt us the most, and this is probably a take-home message today, is budwood source trees. Before you start screening in your structures and building tables, you really need to build a structure to house and protect your budwood source, because that was probably the biggest weakness in our whole industry was budwood source. It doesn't matter how many greenhouses you have or how many containers and how big you are, but if you don't have a budwood source to support growing trees, you have nothing. Also, we all rely on the government to protect us, and the government, the Department of Ag, they ended up losing their budwood facilities as well from the hurricanes. They got canker, and that was where 100% of their budwood was at. So they had a small supply in another location, so they kind of had to start from scratch like everyone else. So they got a little taste of what we had to go through. Next is the real bad disease called greening disease. They make a lot of comparisons, and canker is kind of like having hemorrhoids, and greening is like having cancer. So take it for what it's worth, that's how serious greening is. It's spread by an insect called the citrus Asian psyllid. We had the psyllid introduced in 1998 through Miami, of course, Port of Miami. And then a few years following, we found out we had greening, which was detected in '05. So what happened, we had mass chaos in the industry. We had a lot of growers that wanted to shut down nursery tree movement immediately because everybody was in fear and panic, and because it is a serious disease. But unfortunately, what they didn't understand from the previous program we had, the canker program, they ran out of money. So that's one reason why they also quit taking out the canker trees, because the government didn't have any more money to fund a taking. So if there's ever a government taking by law, they have to reimburse you. And that's just the way the law is. So they can't take out all your trees, whether they have greening or not, unless they reimburse you. Now, that's the way it is in Florida. I'm sure that's similar law in California. So we formed a committee called the Florida Citrus Plant Protection Committee, and that committee comprised of about 5 nurserymen and 5 production managers from the Production Managers Association, and it was overseen by the Department of Ag officials. And what the purpose of that committee was is to make up some rules and regulations that we all could live with, because the growers were on one side of the fence that wanted to shut us down immediately, and the nurserymen, we wanted to just get rid of our existing trees, so we had time to conform to these new laws. So that's when we came up with all these requirements, and the first one was a date we had set. As of January 1st, 2007, all nursery propagations must be in an insect-proof structures. They must have a positive air displacement and double entry doors, and I'll show you some pictures of that here later. And, of course, it has to be, if you're wanting to put in a new nursery site, you have to be at least 1 mile from any existing citrus groves or trees. The existing nurseries were grandfathered in. That's something that y'all might want to take in consideration, because you got a lot of overhead and wells, offices, just people, and you kind of have to hopefully regulatory will understand that. So that's what happened. We were grandfathered in, and the Department of Ag felt comfortable with the structure, so that's why they allowed it. One thing that works pretty well for us that has changed since the canker experience we had, the Department of Ag got a little smarter, because in years past, when they would show up at your site, it's kind of like the SS, the Gestapo. They showed up and they wanted answers, and they had the right to come inspect your facility, or basically you got quarantined. So what they developed in January of 2007 is the Department of Ag had some procedures, and they wanted to test annually all the registered budwood trees we call scion trees, or y'all call them certified trees, or mother trees. And it also comprised of some getting the nurseries inspected every 30 days. And what they do is they inspect for holes in the structures, or maybe the accessibility is not correct. And also they're looking for the psyllid and any other disease issues that might be prevalent. And if they find anything, you get quarantined. Now, the way it works is if you get canker, you get quarantined for 90 days. If you get the Asian citrus psyllid found, it's an indefinite quarantine. So, and plus, they'll probably require you to test some trees in that area of the house to make sure they don't have any greening. So, but the team of inspectors, they were sympathetic from the canker experiences, and they're trained inspectors, and some of them were fellow nurserymen. So it really was a good fit for us, and things started getting a lot better for us. Probably the most important things you need to think about when you decide where you want to put your nursery at, if you're going to do it in an existing place, is you got to make sure you have good water quality, because plants have to have water just like people do to survive and grow. So make sure you got a good water source, and also look at the other areas for your site selection. Like make sure it's a well-drained site. Don't put it in an area where it's not properly drained. And of course, you don't get much rain out here, but there is places that do get wet even here in California. And make sure you got accessibility utilities. The first company I worked with back in 1984, we found a real good site, had good water quality. The problem is we didn't have any power, any electricity. So it took us about 4 months before the power company finally ran us a power line. So make sure you, do your homework. And also the proximity to your customers. In Florida right now, there's a couple of nurseries that decided to get out of the citrus belt, and they got a long ways away, about 3 to 5 hour drive. The only problem was I didn't realize they were a little too far out, because the price of fuel is pretty expensive. So customers in Florida, I'm sure here it's the same. They don't order 10,000 trees at one time. They want maybe 500 or 600. So it's kind of hard to travel for 500 or 600 trees going 300 or 400 miles. And also labor availability. That's important too. Wherever you select your site, make sure you have plenty of labor and people, because, unfortunately in the nursery business, I always refer to the citrus nurserymen as kind of the Roger Dangerfields of the citrus industry. We don't get any respect. And the reason why I say that is a lot of growers, they'll pick up the phone. I'm sure this happens to y'all all the time. They call and they want trees, like right now. They don't have them on contract, of course. Or you'll say, well, we'll have them here in a couple of months. And they don't understand it really takes about a year to grow a tree, but they want action now. And they just think we can do that and we got them, but it doesn't work that way. I'm going to touch on the structures a little bit. I know we've had some previous speakers, and I'm not here to undermine them. I'm just giving you some experiences we had in Florida. And basically, there's several type of structures. They all got different costs, and you kind of need to go with what you think fits your operation the best. So I'm not here to confuse you. I'm just going to give you some selections to choose from. This is a budwood house, and it's a bow structure. It's 22 feet wide. And the reason why we did that is it's got the poly plastic on top. It's 6 mil plastic. It's double poly. It already comes in a tube. And anything that's over about 24 feet, you have to use single poly. So the name of the game, when we replace this poly every 2 to 3 years, you have to do it very quickly, because you don't want to have any incursion of the psyllid. And we usually do it in the wintertime when it's not too cold and the psyllid population's low. And, of course, it's ventilated. There's no fans. It's just got these side curtains. So when it gets pretty hot, we just roll them up. When it gets cold, we roll them down. This is the facility we first had the first picture of, and this is when we first built it. And you see all these bow structures, and they have fans. And that's where we grow our actual citrus nursery trees at. So you got 2 houses that are similar in design, but they serve 2 purposes. Affordability, that's another thing you need to ask yourself, what can I afford? Not too many people build wooden house frames anymore because they don't last. You need to get the best bang for your buck. So really, the 2 type of structures that exist that's most popular in Florida is the bow structures and then the sawtooth structures. And the sawtooth structures, the way they operate, they got an opening right here up top toward the peak. And the purpose of that is they allow natural ventilation and let the hot air out when it gets, it gets very hot in the summertime. Unfortunately, when you screen that opening, which you have to by law, every opening in a greenhouse has to be screened, it restricts the airflow of that sawtooth. So it's probably, unless you have another means of cooling it, that's probably not going to work. So that's why most everyone went to bow houses. The price range, and this is in Florida, is around $5 to $8 a square foot. There's a range there. Usually your sawtooths are a little bit more expensive. This is a cable pole structure. This is actually the nursery, or existing nursery we had before all the rules and regulations changed. And the way it operates, there's a black sleeve right here, if you can see. And the purpose of that black sleeve is there's a winter covering, winter fabric in there, and we just roll it down like a shower curtain in the wintertime. And just we'll also do the roof the same way. And, of course, this is already screened, and that's got some rootstock material in there that we're using. So, and that facility is pretty cheap. It's probably, counting the screen and the winter fabric and the poles and everything, it's probably about $3 a square foot. There's another picture of it right here. This is where it's screened. This is where it's not. Of course, there's no citrus in here. That just shows you kind of what it looks like. I know it's not a good picture. It's a little dark. Okay, the $1 million question is, how do you get in a greenhouse with your people and yourself, without allowing any insects to get in? What we have is what we call these double entry doors. Some people call them vestibules. They got all kind of names. I call them double entry doors, because basically you go through one set of doors, go in this little screen holding area, and then you go through another set. And there's a positive air fan right up above this. And I'll show a little better picture here in a minute. But when you open that door up, there's a switch that triggers a fan to come on. And you need to have it, of course, it's got to be approved by the state, before you can grow anything in it. But it's got so much air force that it'll literally just blow your sunglasses off your face, because the purpose of it is to keep any insects from clinging to your clothing or hair or hat or whatever, and from carrying into the house. And maybe it's not 100%, but it's pretty close. And also make sure you go through a disinfectant station to sanitize. I mean, you don't have to sanitize for the Asian citrusilla, but for canker and other diseases we don't yet have, it'd be nice to do that. Here's another example of a fan. This is a Schaefer fan. It's a 24-inch fan. When you open up the door, there's a little trigger device right there. And when you open up the door, this fan comes on, and it's got a pretty good amount of air. Here's the sanitation. These little bars have got nozzles on them. There's a little tank. It's got the sanitizing material. So you walk through here, get sanitized, and get the smelling really good. Then you walk through the door here. So, we make the rooms, some of them are a little larger than others, because sometimes you have to bring plant material in and out. You can never have both doors open at the same time. That loses the purpose of keeping insects out. Only one door opens at a time. This is in Brazil, and they have a little different climate and a little different thought process. And their gutter height's 12 foot. Some of them are 15. And this price range on these are a little less because they don't have any polycarbonate or any poly on their houses. They don't really have to worry about freezes or cold weather in Brazil, but they still have to worry about the Asian citrusilla. So this whole structure here is screened. The roof is, and also the sidewalls. This is a structure, actually it's in Morocco, and they've got, you see these are all individual, and see they got the little double door entryway here, and they're all compartmentalized. They're isolated from each other, which might be a good idea to do. And but the problem is they get really hot, because remember the heat rises, and the taller your structure is, the quicker you can get the heat up off your people and the trees. And there's the little vegetables I was telling you about, are the double entry doors. All right, longevity of screen. I know there's some screen manufacturers here, but I'm going to tell you what the Florida experiences are. Generally, they last anywhere from 3 to 5 years. And it just depends on the screen manufacturer that you use. And the kind that we use, that we've had the most success with, is the polyfilament, like they make the fishing line out of. And polyfilament is real durable. We use a 50 mesh. And mesh refers to the number of threads per inch in each direction it goes. And the monofilament makes sure it's got UV inhibitor in it. That's very important, because that's the questions you need to ask. Does it have UV inhibitor in it? Is it polyfilament? And ask those two questions, because that's got to be a must. Because I know here in California you have a lot of sun too, even though you're not called a sunshine state. But the sun does it degrades and breaks the screen down just like it does the plastic, the poly. So remember that. That's very important. And also, we have found, everybody thinks of a screen that has square holes. They also make it rectangle. And the rectangle holes are actually, they're not much larger. They're just, of course, a rectangle is a little longer than a square, but just as wide. And it actually increases the airflow a little bit. So our biggest concern is in a structure that's got screen is make sure you properly ventilate and get the heat out, because it gets pretty hot. Here's an example of a double screen. I don't have that personally, but some people do. But it gets really hot in there during the day. I mean, employees can only stay at about noon and they have to leave. So we didn't want to have that either. Another take-home message here is screen is going to be your weakest link in the structure. The Brazilians had a lot of screen. They were fine with it. I'm not fine with it. And the reason why is as the screen ages, I don't care who the screen manufacturer is, as it ages and deteriorates, the threads start to loosen up on it. And what happens is the threads will move on the screen. And that's just part of the aging process. And when it moves, it creates a little larger opening than what was already made for. And what can happen is you can have holes just start appearing on your screen just from the aging process, and you got to really pay attention and get it patched. So that's why I said screening is your weakest link. So maybe not have as much exposure to screening. I'll show you some examples of that. Also, you always got varmints trying to dig and get through your get into the house for whatever reason. Maybe in the wintertime they're cold, they want to get warm too. I don't know. Also, you'll have accidents from employees using nursery stakes. They'll poke a hole in it. Or the citrus trees, they have thorns on them, so the thorns can accidentally rub up against the screen and create a hole. So just be careful, when you put your tables in, or if you've grown them on the ground, don't have them right up against the screen wall, your trees, because they'll cause some problems for you later. Well, I just said it. There it is. Screen's your weakest component of the structure. The more screen you have, the more vulnerable you're going to be to insect introductions. But screen is a necessity for ventilation. It's one of those deals where you got to have it. Just try to minimize it if you can. Heating and cooling. We probably don't have as cool of nights as y'all have. We're more concerned about the heat, but we can get cold. We got down to 19 degrees Fahrenheit December 10th last year. And this is an example of an LP, and a lot of you have this, of a heater inside the structure. This is the cooling wet pad in here as well, so it's a dual-purpose system. So, like I say, our biggest concern is for cooling, what you have here. But this is actually a greenhouse up in North Florida. One of the guys who went way up north, and he found out real quick his heating bill is pretty expensive. This is the method we use. Well, I got the little arrow. That's a little micro sprinkler they call micro jets or maxi jets. But our well water in Florida, and we got plenty of water, most areas, is our well water is about 72 degrees Fahrenheit year round. So it's kind of got a natural heating water. So, and this is all controlled by a thermostat. So when it gets down to like 50 degrees, the thermostat will kick the pump on, and this little micro sprinkler is a low volume. They go down as low as 5 gallons per hour, and it just creates a mist. And when that warm water hits the cool atmosphere, it creates a fog. And of course, the fog is all these little warm water particles floating around that heat your house up. One other thing, like I said, we had 19 degrees. We had 19 degrees one winter day year before last as well, and the houses for some reason never get out of the 50s. I don't know why, but they don't, if it's closed up properly. This is not a very good picture, but this is a cooling pad in a house. It's also got shade, and the purpose of this structure is we actually have a tissue culture lab. I'll show you some pictures of that in a minute, but the out of the lab are kind of sensitive. They need to be acclimated, not just for heat, but for light. So we put it in a little bit friendlier environment than the greenhouse. So this is kind of like a little staging area to help get them adapted. But this is the interior of the cooling pad you'll see. This is what's really important. In Florida, cooling pads probably aren't as effective as they are here in California. And the reason why is all the cooling pad does is, of course, it cools the air, but it adds a lot of humidity to the air. And, of course, you got a fan at the other end, opposite end of the structure, that's pulling that air, that hot air, through that cooling pad, and it cools it, but also humidifies the air. It comes through the greenhouse. When Florida, when I left, it was 95% humidity. So we don't need any more damn humidity. And it was 95 degrees, too. So here it's probably a little different. You have a drier climate, so cooling pads would probably work. So if you have a wet pad, you've got to screen it because the insects will go through that wet pad. And this is the screen here. And if you look through the screen, there's the wet pad right there. And of course, here's the screen structure on the outside. And you have to come a certain amount of feet off the cooling pad because you can't put the screen right up against the cooling pad, because if you do that, it'll just suck the screen right on through the pad. So I think there's a formula. I'm not an engineer. I just grow trees. But the formula, I think, is about 6 to 7 foot off the cooling pad, and you got this little room. One thing that we did do in the room, we put some small little budwood trees in here because I hate losing space. That's in a greenhouse, you're paying for that structure. You got a lot of overhead, so you want to try to get every little tree you can per square foot if you can. So there's none in here yet because this thing was just completed about 2 months ago. But we've got another house similar to this. That's what we have in here is just some little small potted budwood trees. This is our facility, and we have a Dutch rolling bench system. It's expensive. Of course, it's made in Europe, so everything's better in Europe. But the way it operates is the you've got this transport line, I call it an interstate, and off the interstate you got all these little exits. And this is an exit right here. This is a whole row of trees. And if you look, there's only a 2-foot aisle in the greenhouse. And the purpose of this, we don't work the trees in this house. These plants roll out to this transport line, then they're rolled into the head house, which I'll show you here in a minute. So the object of this operation is the people working in a confined area all day long, and it's ventilated. It's a metal building. It's also insulated, so where it doesn't get very hot. It might get up to 85 degrees Fahrenheit at the warmest. In the greenhouses right now, it's probably about 115 in there. So if you're working in over 100-degree temperature, you're not going to last very long in the greenhouse that day, and your productivity is going to really go down. So the object of this type of facility is not just to maximize trees per square foot, but what it does is it makes a comfortable environment for your people to work in. And also you'll find out you'll use less people in this type of operation. So the plants come to the people, and of course they've got their environment, and the people have their environment. So you got two environments. This is something that probably a lot of you have, and most of the nurseries in the state of Florida have this. This is just a fixed bench. Here's your aisleway. You walk down the aisle. You work on the trees on each side of the table. The tables are fixed and never move. So it's probably economic. It's a little cheaper than the rolling benches, but the rolling benches actually pay for themselves a lot quicker because you're getting more trees per square foot, and also you're sizing trees. If you can imagine, when you grow a citrus tree, you always have trees are like people. You can bud them all at the same time, but you always have some that are laggards, that are small for various reasons, and it could be genetics. It could be they weren't budded right, that one tree wasn't. Might not be getting enough water or fertilizer like the trees next to them. So what happens is you have a table of various sizes of trees. So what happens is you're like, well, I want to put all the little ones together. Well, all your little ones might be way the hell over there about 400 feet. So it's kind of impossible to carry several hundred or thousand trees from point A to point B. So that's why I refer back to this rolling bench system. What we do is we size them, and we'll put all the little ones in this area, and the bigger ones go in this area, and they actually get watered and fertilized a little differently. And what we found out amazingly is our cull rate really went down. Usually we cull about 85% from start to finish. Now it's about 95%. So we gained 10% more trees with this rolling bench system, so that helped go toward paying for it. This is the head house where all the work's done. The tables roll in this facility. We've got tunnels. There's a tunnel right here. There's a tunnel here. And they got roll-up doors where each set of houses or each range is isolated from another one. So if we get a disease in this one, it doesn't quarantine the whole operation. So remember about being isolated. When you put your houses in or retrofit your houses, don't have them all connected because what happens if you get an incidence of a psyllid in there or any other disease, they're going to quarantine that whole facility, that whole structure. So try to have it isolated to where you got them compartmentalized, where you got, they're all little different compartments. But basically the trees, these are workstations. See this little rod here, it's opened up, we call it a gate. It's part of the rail system. When they get done working, these ladies here, they'll actually connect that back to this rail, and they'll roll the tables out into the houses where they belong. Most of our trees are still grown by seedlings. We plant the seed. We get seed from Jackie. We've got our own seed as well. But these are T-rail tables. These are trays. These are some liners. They're probably about 10 or 12 inches tall. Should have already been planted. But that's how we start them. We start them in a separate facility where they just get taken care of a little differently than the trees do, because they're a whole different, got a whole lot of different requirements. Seedling are more sensitive. This is the other means of propagation if you don't have any seed. And we learned this back in the 80s. We had a bacteria spot back in the 80s, and the Department of Ag kind of jumped the gun and thought it was canker, and they went and burned all these nurseries, destroyed all the seed trees and budwood trees, and then they found out it wasn't canker, and they said, uh-oh. So they had to reimburse the nursemen for the taking once again. So they boxed all the citrus growers on a tax, and that tax money went to replace what they destroyed. Unfortunately, when you destroy a tree, it's 20 or 50 years old, it's producing seed fruit. It just didn't get back to that size in a year or two. So what happened, it created a big shortage, and unfortunately that happened with the nursery I was working with. So we visited doing tissue culture, or they call it in vitro, and you still have to start out with seed, and basically you get the embryo out of the seed and you grow it in this media. There's a little plant gel right there, and that media has got it's a combination of course water. It's been sterilized, and it's an agar gel. It's got plant hormones in it. The tricky part on growing these rootstocks is not all rootstocks have the same requirements for hormones and sugar or water or whatever. They've got a different needs because we use about 15 different rootstocks in Florida. So what necessarily works for Cleo might not work for trifoliate. So you have to have a cake, like a cake recipe. You've got to have a different formula for each one of these varieties. And some of them are very similar, but it gets really complicated. That's why there's really nobody else doing it. But with the experience we had in the 80s, I was a little concerned about, of course, they weren't sure if greening was seed transmissible. And greening is seed transmissible. That's a fact, no fiction. But it's at such a small amount that they feel comfortable it won't be translocated to that citrus nursery tree. So 4 years ago, we didn't know all this. So in order to protect our interests, they required us to stay in the Fed to make these facilities screened and keep the pest out. But if you have infected seed or seedlings that have greening, you're just bringing in another means, the disease. So, of course, we didn't know that then. We do a little bit better now. So that's why we put this lab in. And this is the next stage from the tubs. They go to this little container we have. And all these little plants, all the purpose of them they're all rootstocks. Y'all use a lot of trifoliate here. And the purpose is we take cuttings off of these and we put them in a mist bed and we grow them. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is back on the tissue culture, one thing that we found out is we get them DNA tested because we use a lot of Swingle citromolo in the nursery, the rootstock, and usually about 30 to 35% of it is off types. They're not true to type. They're mutations, and they just don't give you a productive tree. So that's the downside on seedlings. That's why we always compensate and plant more seed than what we really need to compensate for the runts and the mutations. But if you get these DNA tested and determine they're true to type, of course, throw the ones that aren't true to type, and keep the ones that you have. When you plant them in this stage here, all these are true to type plants, and it eliminates your cull factor of ones that aren't true to type. So actually, it's maybe a little cheaper in the long run, but it's a huge investment. And then you got to also find somebody who knows how to do it. So fortunately, I'm not a geneticist or a tissue culture expert, but I work with people that were, and we just hired them as a contractor, and they actually work for us and signed the agreement and said they can't do it for anybody else. So we got some proprietary information, and that's kind of how it started. But we also kept the industry in mind. We made the lab large enough where it could actually grow about 5 million trees a year. That's what we felt like the potential of the industry would be. So we didn't want to eliminate what sometimes competitors, you like to eliminate some of them. We kept the industry in mind to where we could provide enough stock for the whole industry at a price. This is back to that budwood structure I was telling you about, and what I'm going to talk about is probably the most important thing, like I said, is budwood. If you leave here, you need to wake up in the middle of the night screaming budwood because it's very important. That's what happened in Florida was everybody had a great idea of screening their houses in, but they forgot the state had their budwood source infected with canker, so they had to burn it. So there really wasn't any budwood available. We were blessed. We probably had one of the few screened budwood houses in the state. Matter of fact, that's it there. That structure we built back in 2000, and we built it for a whole different reason. It had nothing to do with greening or canker. We built it because we were losing our budwood source trees to Tristasia strains because they were outside. They would get Tristasia transmitted from the aphid. So what happened is the state said, hey, you got Tristasia, you can't cut buds off of the tree. So we started losing, 5 to 10% a year. So I scratched my head and I said, well, the way this thing is going, we won't have any budwood available. So we made a screened bowwood house, planted the trees in the ground. I'll show you an example of that right here. These are planted 8 by 8, and when they get about 4 years old, they'll yield about 5,000 buds a year. And of course, that's over about 4 cuttings. And remember, you're growing these trees for budwood. You don't care about fruit. All you want to do is just grow a massive tree fast to get all these sticks of budwood off of. So put them on probably an aggressive growing rootstock, like maybe Voca Mariana lemon or rough lemon. Don't put them on trifoliate because they'll never get any size. You know, you want to maximize your budwood protection in these houses because, see, you got all this overhead of the structure. So that's coming at a big cost. So the more buds you get, the more you can spread out your cost on that structure. Same way of growing trees. So these are staggered set. In other words, there's a tree here. On the next row, that tree fills in that gap between the other 8 feet. If you understand that. This is an increase block. That's another category for budwood protection. The slide before was a mother block or a certified budwood tree, or we call it a registered sign tree. And those buds that come off of that mother block in the ground are these trees here. And all we did, we multiplied it second generation. That's why they call it an increase block. This is probably the most efficient means of making budwood very quickly. The mother trees are nice and big, but the problem is if you look at buds per square foot in a house, this is the most efficient means. This produces more budwood. Matter of fact, this house is the same, well, that's a little bit longer, but the house that I showed you before, there's about 70 trees in this house. Of course, mainly, you want to make sure it's varieties you're going to use. Don't put something off the wall like a Buddha hand and not sell any of it. Now, you want to have something in there that you're cutting and utilizing. So, but if you look at these structures on budwood per square foot, this house here produces about 350 bud eyes. 350,000 bud eyes a year. This one here produces a little over 1 million a year. So we sell budwood to other nurseries. But see, they're in these 3-gallon pots. This pot here is 9 inches in diameter. It's 19 inches tall. They have a life of 36 months. Once they get past 36 months, you have to replace them with a new stock. And what we can do, we have an option. We can move these into a mother block or a bigger container and call them a sign tree. Of course, they got drippers in here. That's another thing. You don't probably want to have overhead irrigation on your, which I don't think any of you do out here, on your budwood trees because that just creates more fungal issues if you're not careful. But this is the most efficient means. Each one of these trees will produce 150 bud eyes. They average 150 bud eyes a year. What's that? Well, actually, being a smaller tree, it's more juvenile than a tree planted in the ground. And you actually get, I don't know exactly how many cuttings. We go in there and cut off of them every month. So we probably cut 12 times a year off of them because they're always, a juvenile is always growing and doesn't know when to stop. So you just take advantage of it and get more budwood. This is another means. This is called also an increased block, but this is in our regular nursery container in that Dutch rolling bench system. These buds came from the mother trees that were planted in the ground, so they're an increased block as well. They're just in a smaller container. And we get quite a bit of budwood off of these, but it's a short-lived, because we're actually selling these trees to a customer. And we can actually, these trees are probably about 12 months from buds. They need to be out of here. But we let them just grow wild, and we try to cut as much wood off of them as we can. This is just an example of different containers. This is the 3-gallon container. It's 2 years old. And you see all the little bud sticks you got here. And then this is the regular nursery container we use. Our nursery container, we had to design our own container. It's 5 inches round. It's 10 inches tall. And we had to have a container to stand up on its own. The old Citropot wouldn't work because they're not designed perfectly square. So they're tapered. They're small on the bottom and big up top. So, but you can see the size difference between the two on yielding budwood. Here's another example. This is a mother tree here, but it's in a big container. These are 30-gallon containers. That's the 3-gallon container, and that's the 1-gallon container. So you can see how much budwood you can get off of that. You got to have a little bit more spacing. So it all goes back to how many buds per square foot you get. So if you look at this, you got this big gap in here. Of course, this tree here is only about, it was a nursery tree we planted in that pot. So it's about 2 years old, 2.5 years old. So it hadn't reached its potential yet. But this is just another means of producing budwood. If for the money, the best deal is this one right here, the 3-gallon container. And here's another example of it here. These are mother trees that are planted in large containers. They're on a 6x6 staggered set. Remember, the mother trees planted in the ground were 8x8 staggered set. And the reason why is these trees, they don't get as big as the ones planted in the ground, so you can put them a little closer together. These are 4-year-old trees, and they produce about an average about 2,000 buds per tree per year. This is just an overview of the nursery here again. There's the head house. We planted, and that's part of your site preparation. You probably need to have it secured with a fence. And these are windbreak trees. These are eucalyptus trees we planted. And we also got cedars planted here. And the purpose of that is, in Florida we get a lot of hurricanes and really damaging winds. So we got a barrier around the whole nursery here with a windbreak. Of course, these trees, they grow about 15 feet a year. So that picture there, they're probably maybe a year old. So eventually they'll get probably 100 feet or better. This is just statistics of what our nursery industry comprises of. And you can see how many nurseries we had in 2010 propagating. There's 45. When the program started, we had 35, and it gradually went up. Just to give you an idea, back in the late 70s, early 80s, there was over 1,500 citrus nurseries in the state of Florida. Of course, that's back when we had 980,000 acres of citrus, almost 1 million acres. Now we only got about 580,000 acres. So, there's a scale there. As the industry shrinks, so does the nurseries. They shrink as well. And there's just some little charts here about how big certain nurseries are with how many trees they produce. That's it.